congratulate her more first for losing 90 pounds.
Yep.
That's a challenge. I mean, there are a lot of people that are very plus size people that are struggling with this. And I can tell you, ketogenic diet is the best way, full stop, to naturally lose that weight, without surgeries and without drugs or anything like that. So that's great. And if you're reducing that adiposity burden, the cellular molecular activities that are causing you to lose that weight are also very positive in terms of preventing you from getting cancer. And
absolutely,
as someone whose parent died of cancer, I don't want to get it either. So far, touch wood, so good. So far, so good. And so I think, she's absolutely doing the right thing.
Yep. And based on the chart that we showed earlier, let's talk about hyperinsulinemia now, because I've heard you talk about that before, and I think you and I agree on this completely. Of course, when you eat a diet that's high in sugar, in starches, in any kind of carbohydrates, it's going to spike your blood sugar, but then your pancreas is immediately going to try to pull the blood sugar back down to normal by spiking your insulin. And so if people are eating a high carb diet every day with snacks in between, they're going to have something that I've started calling hyperinsulinemia. And some people speak about this as insulin resistance, which I think may be kind of an upside down and backwards way of thinking about it, because you can actually measure serum insulin.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But you can't really measure insulin resistant directly. And so everything on this chart is affected by not only high blood sugar, but also by hyperinsulinemia, chronically elevated levels of insulin. So kind of make this a global statement of how changing your diet is going to decrease your risk of having all these things.
Yeah. So I don't know if you have it available, but I have this model. It's on one of my slides called the axis of illness. And if you look,
I have that one, doctor.
Yeah, I may have linked you to the wrong slide deck, but that's okay. You picture a triangle, and on that triangle, you have insulin resistance at the top, you have obesity on one of the bottom sides, and you have inflammation on the other. And I think you talk to any clinician or any physician, and they'll tell you, boy, if you can do something for those three things, reduce obesity, which is a disease, reduce insulin resistance, reduce inflammation, each of those independently is responsible for about 70% of chronic disease. So collectively, there's a tremendous power if you can find one way to treat all those things at the same time. And this is what a ketogenic diet does, because it reduces all of those things. So when you talked about hyperinsulinemia, which is the correct term, which means you're chronically excessive levels of insulin in the blood. What causes that? It's caused by chronically ingesting too much carbohydrate and stimulating the release of that insulin. So that's caused absolutely by a high carb diet. A high carb diet will also lead to obesity. It just will. It's your body's way of getting rid of that excess glucose and storing it. And if your insulin levels are even slightly elevated, it really biases that towards storing as fat rather than burning in the cells. So you put inflammation in there as well. Cardiovascular disease is not caused by cholesterol or high fat diet. It's caused by inflammation in the blood vessels. And all of those three elements, I call them the axis of illness. So we have insulin resistance, we have obesity, we have inflammation. They all make each other worse. And so once you get, it doesn't matter which comes first. Once you get one started, the other two will keep going, and it'll just keep getting worse until you change your lifestyle. And eventually it wears your body down. So you can't just keep secreting too much insulin forever. Those beta cells in your pancreas that release them get tired. And all of a sudden, we don't have any insulin left, So then what do you have to do? You have to start taking units of insulin every day just to get your blood sugar down. What's that going to do? It's going to make the disease even worse, right? Because you're adding insulin to people who have glucose tolerance issues. So those three things are all related. And as we talked about earlier, they're all manifestations of metabolic disorder.
Yes.
So your cells are not metabolizing the way they want to because you're giving them the wrong fuel. It's like putting crappy gasoline into your car. If you want to switch to the high octane stuff, that's kind of what ketones are. And your One of the interesting things we've shown in our studies is when we do the imaging of the women before and after being on a ketogenic diet, initially their heart glows, not because they have cancer, because that heart cells love fuel and they'll just, because it keeps going all the time. It's a very anaerobic organ and it'll just sop up all the glucose it can. But when we put them on a ketogenic diet, the heart disappears. Why? Well, it's the glucose there doesn't need it anymore.
Right.
Why is that? Well, because it prefers ketones and fatty acids because they have less stress burden at the cellular level, what we call reactive oxygen species and oxidative stress. So that's that inflammation side of it too, right?
And I think that's so important that people understand that. Everybody listen to this carefully. The muscle cells that make up your heart actually prefer to run on ketones. And we see this in the before and after pictures. If you go and watch some of Dr. Harper's other videos, he actually has motion videos of the PET scans before and after. And you can see the heart in the initial study, when it's a glucose burner, lights up very dark. But then at the end of the study, now that they're keto adapted, right, that heart's burning ketones. It would rather have ketones rather than glucose. But if you're eating a high carb diet, you're not giving it that option. So this goes directly to Tedros's question. You said earlier that if you eat too many carbs, you're going to get fat. And that's very true for some subsets of the population whose genetics are like mine and like yours. 100% will get fat. But there are many people in the world, people in Ethiopia, in India, in the Asian countries, who it's very hard for them to become obese or severely obese, but they can become disastrously hyperinsulinemic. And so for somebody like Tedros's mom, Tedros, probably what's happening is when your mother goes to the doctor, your doc's checking a basic metabolic panel, which checks a fasting blood sugar. Your doctor's probably not checking an A1C, a hemoglobin A1C. And therefore, if your mom fasts for 12 hours before blood work, her blood sugar can be normal. Her fasting glucose can be normal, and she might be severely pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic. And without an A1C, your doctor's blind to that. And she doesn't fatten easily because of her genetic predisposition. Therefore, she looks healthy. Now, even an additional layer to that is most doctors never check a fasting insulin level or a C-peptide. And so your mother could have a normal blood sugar and a normal A1C, but be dangerously hyperinsulinemic. And if your doctor doesn't check a C-peptide and or a fasting insulin, then your doctor's blind to that. And so she gets sent home saying, oh, you're healthy as a horse. You're doing good. Keep doing what you're doing. All the while she's suffering from severe metabolic disease. And I see this all the time. And in many countries, it's almost impossible to get a doctor to order a fasting insulin test. And that's a personal pet peeve of mine as a healthcare provider and practitioner. Let's talk about what's wrong with doctors. Dr. Harper, what the hell is wrong with the average doctor who's recommending Ensure to their obese patients or to their patients who've been diagnosed with cancer, who are saying, here, you've had your chemo treatment. Now here's some orange juice and some cookies. What the hell is going on in these doctors' minds? Do they magically believe that the human diet somehow is just magically does not matter? Or do they just not give a damn? Or are they so nutritionally ignorant that they don't even realize that the shit that they're promoting to their patients is actually promoting metabolic disease? Time to bring it, Dr. Harper. Let's hear it. What's your opinion?
Well, I have good friends that are physicians, yourself included. I don't want to paint them all with the same brush. I think it's our system. Again, it's a disease management system, so it's easy to provide a pill. So I think there's a lot of Americans, a lot of people in the West, Canadians, whatever, that are obese, and they just want to keep eating what they're eating, and they want the pharmacy industry to come up with a pill that's going to prevent them from getting obese or getting sick. That's not the right way to go about it. I think that they don't get any nutrition education in the first place. Secondly, is I don't think they are necessarily up to speed on the research because, there's there's a million publications a year, 3,000 a day in health science. It's hard to keep up with all that stuff. So, why aren't they listening to what's happening? It takes about 17 years for a scientific discovery to get into basic clinical practice in a physician's office. Again, ask yourself, do I have 17 years to wait for this to happen?
Right.
What I'm finding is just what you were finding too, is now the physicians are sort of getting that information from their patients. They're going, hey, wow, you've lost a lot of weight. That's great. Look, your blood sugar is great. Your blood lipids are great. What have you been doing? Well, I went on this keto diet. And they go, oh, okay. Because what you probably learned was ketoacidosis, right? High ketones is from late stage diabetes, and it can kill you. So they hear the word keto and they think it's dangerous. Well, it's not. It's natural, and you have that proper human diet. I have that natural human diet. Babies are in ketosis in the womb. They're born in ketosis and they stay in ketosis as long as they're breastfeeding. This is the natural, proper human state, is a state of nutritional ketosis. And so when you put your body into that state, it prevents you from having a metabolic disorder that will manifest as a disease. So you don't even end up in the physician's office in the first place. That's the best thing. Now,
Absolutely.
can we re-educate them? That's what we really have to do. That's why your show and others like it are so important, because I am part of an organization called the Canadian Clinicians for Therapeutic Nutrition. I think there's 8,000 now, mostly physicians. They're saying, hey, wait a minute. We never really learned any nutrition. Now that we looked at it, maybe we have this whole thing wrong. And the other part of that wrong thing, Dr. Barry, is getting someone to admit they were wrong. Especially if they've been telling people to do something for 20 or 30 years and go, you know what, all that low fat stuff I told you, I got to apologize. So those who read my book, Bio Diet, that's one of the first things I do. I said, I taught the wrong stuff for 30 years before I realized what I didn't do as a scientist. I didn't go back and look for the primary research that tied high fat diets to disease. And when I did, I didn't find it because it doesn't exist.
Right.
There was one guy in his gang, Ansel Keys, that tried to drive that hypothesis forward, and they drove it into the American Cardiology Society, and they drove it into the dietitians, and we have this model, which is really just a hypothesis that a low-fat, high-carb diet is a healthy diet. And as I say in my book, we did an experiment on the Western world for about 30 years telling him to eat that. And look at the data yourself. What happened since the first guidelines for nutrition came out in 1980? Skyrocketing rates of diabetes, skyrocketing rates of obesity, skyrocketing rates of inflammatory related diseases, which is why you measure that C-reactive protein. So that's association, sure it is, but we can also tell you on the cellular molecular level that eating all those high sugar, high processed foods is going to make you sick. And if you're eating those, you have to stop, and you have to learn to eat and enjoy a proper human diet, a natural human diet, which is high fat, high omega-3, grass-fed butter, eat your meat, eat the skin, eat the fat. You have to start doing that. And when you do, I can tell you two things. It will do no harm, but there is a transition period. So you should discuss it with a physician because, as you know, Dr. Barry, there's often a need for concomitant reduction in antihypertensive and anti-hyperglycemic drugs.
Absolutely.
So you need to talk to your physician before you start. But once you do it for 12 weeks and see what happens. And I would be shocked if you didn't go, oh my God, I've been rejuvenated. That's why I call one of the stages rejuvenation, right? You just do this for 12 weeks and you go, I don't hurt anymore. I've lost all this body fat. My brain is cleared up. I seem to be more cognitively functional. And if it doesn't work, which happens, for about 1 out of 8 people, it doesn't work, then carry on with whatever you were doing before. But don't eat the crappy food that they're trying to sell you that tastes good and you can't stop eating it, and then hope that the medical system is going to be able to fix you. What you need to do is get that stuff out of your diet, eat a proper human diet, and then you can move on to a happy, healthy life.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The other thing, if you look at, Asians, if you look at South Asians in India, huge rates of obesity and heart disease in males in India for sure. And then a lot of them, yes, it's a high carb diet, but it's also you're malnourished. It's really, really hard to get full nutrition, which is what we call a balanced diet. It's really hard to do that if you're not going to eat meat and a lot more fat. You need about 40% of your calories from fat just for your brain to be happy.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think there's a bit of a misnomer that Asians eat a lot of rice. They eat rice at the end of the meal if they're still hungry, right?
Yeah.
And it's only a small amount, and I guess the other question was, can people adapt to be sort of more resistant to carbs. Well, you can actually test for that genetically, and some people do metabolize carbs better than others, and probably are more resistant to type 2 diabetes. But if you look at, let's look at America. 78% of American adults over 18 are now overweight or obese. That is the definition, or one of the definitions, or one of the key elements of metabolic disease. So you have three-quarters of Americans have metabolic disease.
Yep. And so I'm working more and more with doctors from India now, and it's very common there because the average Indian eats a very high carbohydrate diet. But they're almost uniformly slender. They might have a little belly pooch, but they're not obese like people in America get. And so the argument is, this guy's slender, he's healthy, he doesn't have any markers of disease. And then when I talk to the Indian doctors, they're like, yeah, no doctor here checks fasting insulin. Yeah. Right. And many of them don't even check an A1C. And so they see the normal blood sugar because the person fasted for 12, 14, 16 hours. And they're like, there you go. You don't have diabetes. But if they, first of all, check the hemoglobin A1C, they would see that they have absolutely verifiable prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, in many cases, severe type 2 diabetes.
And if they do, we call it TOFI, thin outside, fat inside. So just because you're lean outside doesn't mean we're talking about the visceral fat that impacts on the organs and so on that you can't see inside. That's the fat that's important, not the little roll of your belly or your bum or whatever. It's the internal stuff. And you can be very thin, but still fat inside. And those people that are thin outside but have type 2 diabetes, they have very poor outcomes, because I actually think that obesity is your body's way of trying not to raise your blood. It's getting that sugar out of your blood and putting it somewhere. It has to go somewhere, so it goes into fat. Those that can't do that to address the adaptability of the metabolic differences, those that can't do that, that blood sugar just stays high and the insulin stays high. So they often have worse outcomes. Sadly.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. We actually talk about it as a protective mechanism. People who are able to fatten very often will be very, very fat. I used to be 297 pounds at my fattest, and I was only pre-diabetic, whereas other people with different genetic diversity, perhaps different gut microbiomes, they wouldn't have got very fat, but they would have been severely type 2 diabetes. And so now, looking back now, I'm very glad that I was a fat ass, because that probably protected me from developing severe uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. Well, and it has a lot to do with your genetic diversity. Doc, if somebody's just joining us right now and they're like, okay, I want you to tell me, Dr. David Harper, PhD, who teaches medical students and teaches residents, I want you to tell me, if you had to just say, okay, here's 3 steps to fix your diet. Here's the stuff you should eat. Here's the stuff you shouldn't eat. Here, this is it. Go.
Don't eat sugar. Don't eat anything processed. So up and down those aisles, don't eat the stuff in the middle of the grocery store that's in a package. If it's in a package, don't eat it. If it says natural or healthy, probably not. Probably not. Probably not. If it says natural or healthy, probably not. Don't eat that. Don't eat that. Don't eat any high glycemic index stuff, sugar, bread, pasta, rice. Don't eat that. Do eat saturated fats. Somebody talked about eggs in here earlier. I eat probably, my wife and I, maybe 3-4 dozen eggs a week. Eggs are, that's why there's an egg on the cover of my book. It's nature's perfect food. And I want to ask you about that a little bit too. So
that's why we bought chicken. We have chickens now in the backyard for that very reason, because eggs are, especially properly raised hens, eggs, unbelievable superfood.
When you think about it, the egg has almost no carbohydrate in it.
That's right.
It's almost zero. Yet somehow, without eating anything, that produces the same 200 tissue types, substitute feathers and hair, as we have. So somehow all the cells know what to do in the complete absence of carbohydrate. And there are no essential carbohydrates. You don't have to eat any at all. Your body can make its own through a process called neoglucogenesis, or making new glucose, gluconeogenesis. Sorry.
Yes.
So that's the main thing is don't worry about saturated fats. Eat what you like. Eat a diet that you enjoy that includes meat and fish and beef and bacon and and just avoid processed foods and avoid sugar and carbohydrate. Just that, and drink more water, be fine. I would like to ask you, because it's something that I've been meaning to ask you though, Dr. Barry, is there's a lot of people when they talk, well, what about fasting? So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on fasting. I have some which I'm willing to share, but I'd like to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, the research that I have reviewed and the anecdotal evidence that I've gotten from literally tens of thousands of people who comment on our videos and are part of our private community, fasting absolutely speeds up the metabolizing fat, stored fat, and so it helps people lose weight faster. For many people, it helps break what I consider to be a real entity. Some doctors don't think it's real, but sugar addiction. I think it helps with that. It absolutely increases your rate of both autophagy, which is your body's recycling of old and damaged cells and breaking them down and building new, healthy, vibrant cells out of them. Not only or autophagy, but also mitophagy, doing the same thing with mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, right? And so if you've got an old, crippled, damaged mitochondria, your body's going to tag that when you fast for longer periods of time. And it's going to break that mitochondria down, and it's going to use those constituent parts to build a new, healthy, vibrant mitochondria. Now, there's always some degree of autophagy and mitophagy going on in your body at all times, even if you're eating just a completely shit diet. You still have some known rate of that, but the rate of autophagy and mitophagy increase dramatically the longer that you fast. And so many benefits. We've had followers of ours for 5 years now who lost over 200 pounds, David. And you would expect them to look like Shar-Pei puppies, right? but they made intermittent fasting a big part of their weight loss journey, whether it was an 18 or a 20-hour daily intermittent fast, or whether they fasted for 3 days once a week or 5 days once a month. They just made that part of their lifestyle. And now to look at them, you know how some people lose weight and you can look at them and be like, well, they've obviously lost weight, but you can tell they used to be really large just by looking at them. These people look like they were never fat. And this doesn't happen for everybody, and I think it's because of that normal distribution curve that every single thing in human physiology is plotted upon. I think there are some people that fasting like that is just borderline magical in the body recomposition that it can have. Other people, it doesn't seem to have as much effect. Of course, these are not controlled studies, so we're not peeking into their living rooms and seeing if they're actually fasting or not. We're just going from self-reported data. I'd love to hear your thoughts on fasting as well. And then I want to ask you about vegetable seed oils.
Well, no. Okay, so let's do the vegetable seed oils. Just go Google vegetable seed oil processing and look at the pictures, and they look like oil refineries, because that's what they are. That's the most processed food, and it's horrible, highly inflammatory. And nut oils like avocado oil or avocado or olive oil, fine. I like grass-fed butter. That's my favorite fat.
Yes.
But seed oils, absolutely no. They're and especially the really cheap ones like linseed oil and cottonseed oil that they use at those fast food places to fry French fries.
Yeah.
They at McDonald's.
They don't change the grease, doctor. I used to, my dad actually used to be a regional distributor for Kentucky Fried Chicken. He would repair their cookers, and he would take them supplies and stuff. Dude, when I was probably 12, 13, I would go in the back of the KFC store, and it literally smelled so bad that I would have to go sit out on the stoop in less than safe neighborhoods. And my dad would have to come look out the back door every 10 seconds because he didn't want me to get abducted. But it was awful. Everything was slippery and greasy. But he would say, you guys are not changing your oil often enough. And you can understand, as a franchise owner, every time you change that oil, it's probably 30 gallons. That's $400.
Yeah.
And so ideally they're supposed to change it very, very regularly. But any franchise owner is going to be like, well, I'll change it. We'll go another day. It's not too dark. It's not too rancid. We'll go another day. I absolutely, one of my three first things is stop all sugar, both added and natural. stop all grains, all grains. And then number 3, stop all vegetable seed oils. That's been my first 3 recommendations for everybody since 2017. But I have to be honest, I don't find as much research supporting the stop all vegetable seed oils as I find with the first 2. And I always like to ask people about that. Now, eggs.
Yeah. Well, eggs, nature's perfect food, as we said, you get all the, we're vertebrates like chickens are, and you don't need any. So it just tells you don't need carbohydrates for starters. The cholesterol in the eggs does not relate very strongly to the cholesterol in your blood. If you have cholesterol issues, I mean, we don't want to start an hour into an interview talking about whether LDL is worth measuring or not and what the meaning is. But
let's just suffice it. Let's just sum it up like this. The American Heart Association a few years back came out and said, eating cholesterol in your diet is no longer of any concern. Okay. They just very recently came out with a new statement that said that saturated fat in your diet is unrelated to heart disease risk.
And the diabetes associations are now recognizing low carb and ketogenic diets as they're saying, that's another option for you. So they are coming around. And the reason they're coming around, these are very conservative, very risk averse organizations, is that the evidence in support of low carb ketogenic diets is overwhelmingly positive. And there is the first do no harm. Any negative effects are short-term, transitional, and mild. So there are some, and I list them in the book in the first part of the second half. There's about 30 or 40 really rare genetic disorders where you can't metabolize ketones, and for those, the diet would be contraindicated, and you need to discuss that with your physician. It's not something you would know unless you tested for it.
Exactly. And I actually did a YouTube video about that. It's probably 20,000 people in the entire United States who have a genetic defect where they probably shouldn't do keto or a ketovore or a carnivore. It's a minuscule amount of people. The vast majority, 99.99% of people around the world, can enjoy all the benefits of a ketogenic diet. Doc, we're at the hour. Any final thoughts, any final advice to anybody out there? Someone's like, okay, I get it. I hear you guys, but my doctor said I should eat a plant-based diet, lots of whole grains, lots of fruit juice smoothies. Talk to that person, Dr. Harper. Tell them what you think.
Well, I have to sort of, empathize with the physician, because they have decision trees. And you probably talked about this, is when you have certain systems, they go through their decision trees. If the patient says yes, then this is what you prescribe. If they say no, then you go down this. And so they're, if they recommend what the American dietitians organizations say is the recommend, or what the government says, they reduce their liability to zero because they're recommending what's being told. So physicians like yourself who have more courage in reality are saying, actually, we should question that. You actually assume some liability if you get it wrong. And if you had got that wrong, you've been doing this a long time, you'd be in jail right now. And I think it's going to go to jail, the processed food people, because I think they know that this food, this high sugar, high processed, high carb food is killing people.
Absolutely.
If you look at diabetes alone and the burden of treating just type 2 diabetes, which is 90% of diabetes in the United States, and you take the rate of increase of diabetes to where they project it for 2030, the United States alone, people will be spending $660 billion a year just to treat type 2 diabetes. And if you compare that, to put it in context, right now, the US defense budget is about $660 billion a year. So that's what we're spending to treat a disease which is largely preventable and can be reversed. Think of the savings for governments that could then go into schools and hospitals, and maybe better nutrition educating for physicians in medical school. So I guess the news is there is good news. Here we have an option. Do discuss it with your physician. It's not a cure for cancer, if we want to talk about that, but I think it's the most important lifestyle decision that will help prevent you from getting one of these chronic diseases. We didn't even get into Alzheimer's disease because the brain loves ketones too. But
absolutely. That
so
we'll do that another hour, another day.
yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. David Harper, author of The Bio Diet.
What are vegetable oils? These are vegetable oils, the ones that are most commonly known, really. Soybean oil is the one that is really the main contributor to the oils we eat. And they're not really vegetable oils. I mean, it sounds so lovely, doesn't it? You know, I always wonder about what PR room came up with the word vegetable oils. They're not made from vegetable oils. Vegetables, like broccoli or anything, they're made from seeds and beans. So there's actually should be called seed oils. And amongst technical vegetable oil scientists, that's actually what they call them among themselves. Of course, they're not natural. These are the natural fats that humans ate for millennia. There's tallow, which comes from cows, and suet from lambs. Lard these are really the two main ones that were used in cooking in the West. Lard from pigs, and of course butter. In other societies, in Asian societies, they also used coconut oil and palm oil. Those are traditional fats. And you know, we know they're traditional from in the Odyssey. Athena says she lays down a fat goat and the chine of a great wild hog rich in lard for Odysseus, obviously to kill him. No. So vegetable oils of any kind, were really not used for human consumption. They were used for industrial machinery as lubricants. In the Industrial Revolution, I mean, first it was really whale oil from the 1820s to the 1860s, and they were used for machinery. And then when we killed all the whales, we moved over to cottonseed oil, which was a byproduct of, you know, the cotton was a huge crop in the southern United States, and they didn't know what to do with the leftover oil, so they started using that to replace whale oil. And it was not a food. This oil was used a little bit in the late 1800s to adulterate butter, to kind of sneak it in, but here's the problem with oils and human consumption. They are not stable. They're greasy and oily. So this is just to show you the chemistry. A saturated fatty acid has no double bonds in there between the carbon molecules, and so it's straight. A double bond makes a chink in the chain, but if it's saturated, meaning it's saturated with hydrogens, there are no double bonds. So that's straight and flat, and those molecules can sit on top of each other all together, and there's no space between them, and so they make solids. Saturated fats are solid. Whereas unsaturated fatty acids, this is a polyunsaturated fatty acid. Poly means multiple double bonds between the carbons, and they're unsaturated because if you broke this bond and you could add hydrogens here. So it's not saturated with hydrogens. So, and those molecules don't lie flat together. They're all squiggly and wiggly, and so there's space between them, and therefore they're oils. That's the basic chemistry. So in order to use oils as foodstuff, they had to make them straight. And they did this through a process called hydrogenation. So they took oleic acid. This is one of the polyunsaturated fats. Actually, that's not polyunsaturated fat. That's a monounsaturated fat. But anyway, the idea is they straighten it out through a process called hydrogenation. And hydrogenation is a very complex process that involves all kinds, you know, huge factors. I actually have been in a hydrogenation factory, and you know, there's just floors and floors of machinery, and they use metal catalyst and the hexane solvent, and then they go through this incredibly long process, because really when you take seeds or beans and you press them, what comes out is this rancid gray liquid, and then you have to make that palatable. So you have to deodorize it and winterize it so it's stable, and you have to go through all these steps. You don't churn it, and you don't milk it from a cow and churn it. So it's a lot more complicated. But that process is what allowed vegetable oils to come into the food supply. And that happened because once it could be stabilized, actually when they first stabilized, this is Procter & Gamble, who were originally soap makers and tallow makers, and when they first stabilized cottonseed oil in the early 1900s, about 1910 or so, when this process was discovered, they looked at that and they said, oh, we'll sell it as soap. and actually a lot of your soaps are made from oils. That's what's, a lot of soaps are. And then they looked at it and they said, well, that actually looks a lot like lard. Why don't we try to sell it as lard? So, and this is in 1911. So they figured that out, and they had a number of names they eventually landed on this idea of Crisco. And that was the introduction of vegetable oils as a commercial product into the human food supply, really. That was really the beginning of it as a commercial product. And they were brilliant about how they went about marketing this product. And they did it, you have to understand, in America in the early 1900s, particularly in America, everybody wanted the new, well, almost every society, everybody wants the new and the modern. And so this was, they would market Crisco as something, I'm going to quote now, that comes from the book of Crisco. That while Crisco may be a shock to the older generation born in an age less progressive than our own, it is, a modern woman is glad to give up butter and lard, just as her grandmother, quote, her grandmother was happy to forego the fatiguing spinning wheel. So it was supposed to be a liberation. It was also marketed in contrast to the always sort of sordid conditions of animal slaughter and extraction of animal fats. But Crisco was made in sparkling bright rooms and clean countertops and chemistry labs, and they white enamel covers metal surfaces to contrast it to the conditions of making animal fats. So, and it was incredibly successful. I mean, they sold cookbooks and all kinds of pamphlets, and they marketed it, and at the end they said, in every cookbook in America, butter is crossed out and Crisco is put, and butter and lard are crossed out and Crisco is put in its place. And that is what happened. At about the same time, margarine also entered. Margarine is also hardened vegetable oils. Originally, margarine, very early on, it used to be made with lard and coconut oil, which are solid, stable fats. But by 1958, it was made entirely from polyunsaturated fats. And it was a huge threat to the dairy industry. If you want any insight into why, one of the reasons it took me so long to write a book is that, I spent 3 months completely obsessed with margarine and there was this whole incredible chapter of the dairy industry trying to prevent the margarine industry from entering in. And so they had all kinds of taxes and restrictions, and you couldn't sell yellow margarine. You had to only sell it as white, and then you would get a little color capsule that you would knead into it to make it yellow to look like butter. And these are angry housewives protesting that they want their margarine, because of course vegetable oils were very quickly cheaper. They were just cheaper, so housewives wanted them. And eventually it became accepted really in World War II, when even wealthy women wanted to save money, and it was considered okay then to put margarine on an elegant table. And so that was sort of the end of margarine restrictions. So these are so Crisco and margarine are the main ways that vegetable oils entered into our food supply. And that all happened, really they were introduced and solidly in the food supply by the mid 20th century. So, and then when did oil as oil come in? This actually happened in the 1940s because they had figured out, by 1940, they had figured out how to stabilize oil just enough to sell it in a bottle. Remember, oils are rancid products. They oxidize really easily. They go rancid and bad. They have no shelf life stability, but they figured out a little chemical fix in the 1940s, and so now they were able to sell it as oils. And then they, of course, as we know, they got a huge boost when the American Heart Association started recommending polyunsaturated vegetable oils to replace saturated fats. And this was a tremendous boost to the vegetable oil industry, as we know. And this is just my chart to show you what an incredibly ludicrous idea it was at the time that President Eisenhower's heart attack was caused by saturated fats, already declining in the food supply. What was perfectly rising in lockstep with heart disease was unsaturated vegetable oils. So how crazy to think that you would solve a condition with the food that had been just invented and seemed to be perfectly correlated with heart disease. Anyway, and there's also a really interesting backstory about how the American Heart Association had really had deep, deep ties with the vegetable oil industry, and in fact had been launched by Procter & Gamble, a vegetable oil, that one of their products was Crisco. The American Heart Association, so what this enabled the vegetable oil industry to do was to market itself basically as a health food. As a food that you can eat in order to avoid a heart attack. These are some more ads. Take this ad to your doctor so they can prescribe vegetable oils to you. And here's margarine because of course your 8-year-old should worry about cholesterol. In effect, what you're studying a number of things in those trials, but one of the things you're studying is, well, what is the effect of having a high vegetable oil diet? If you have a lot of corn oil and soybean oil, what happens? Well, in nearly a dozen of these studies, they found a number of worrisome things, including that in all the experimental groups, they died at higher rates of cancer. So this is the LA Veterans study, where the men ate diets high in soy, corn, safflower, cottonseed oil. 6 years of this. Wasn't a perfect trial. They didn't control for smoking, say. But it was successful. I mean, one of the markers of a successful trial is that the men did successfully lower their cholesterol, as they did in all the diet heart trials, but they died at more than twice the rate of the control group from cancer. And that was found in other trials as well. They also had 2 times higher rates of gallstones. Gallstone was found in another cholesterol-lowering trial. So maybe it's the vegetable oils, maybe it's the cholesterol lowering, we don't know. Strokes also found in people who have much higher rates than people who have lower cholesterol. And in fact, the PURE study that just came out recently, which was the largest ever epidemiological study ever undertaken, they found that the lower the saturated fat you ate, the people who ate the lowest amount of saturated fat had the highest risk of stroke. So whether or not that's the low amount of saturated fats or the high amount of vegetable oils they're eating or the low cholesterol, we don't know. But that's a disturbing finding that is clearly now echoing through this work. And then there's that hydrogenated oil becomes the backbone of the food industry. So, almost every food in these supermarket aisles is comprised of, usually it's mainly like some sugar, grain, and then they need a fat. You need a fat to make any cookie, cracker, crisp, anything. And that fat is hydrogenated soybean oil. That's just always the way it was. And because it's cheap, it's easy to manipulate. And so every one of these products contains hydrogenated oils, or did until quite recently. These are the natural alternatives. So these are the non-animal-based natural alternatives that can also be used by food manufacturers, and indeed were. For a good part, up until the 80s, these were used by food companies in their products. And they're healthier because they're more stable, and because they're solid fat. They're naturally solid. They don't have to go through that hydrogenation process to become solid. But these were scared out of the U.S. food supply because, for a number of reasons that are really fascinating. One was the American Soybean Association recognized that the tropical oils were a threat to them, and so they came up with this idea. This is Steve Drake, who is the head of the American Soybean Association, when they were doing this whole campaign from 1986 to 1989, and they distributed all these fat fighter kits. What you don't know about tropical oils will kill you. And they pictured like sleazy Asians with cigars, saying putting the wholesome American farmer out of business. And then they came up with the term tree lard, which sounds really appealing and definitely had an effect. And I just put this up because I see echoes of this really in this recent, a couple people have mentioned it, this recent American Heart Association presidential advisory. They focus quite a lot on coconut oil. You're like, why are they focusing on coconut oil? This is in their heart news, which I just have to say as an aside, like here they're creating the controversy, and then here they're saying, why all the hubbub over the controversy we're creating? That's just such a classic tactic. But they really emphasize coconut oil. Coconut oil does not have any different kind of saturated fats than any of the other saturated fats that have all been tested in those randomized controlled clinical trials, finding no effect on mortality. So why are they focusing on coconut oil? Well, it may be that they receive lots of money. This is just one of the things that I happened to found because it actually was somebody who was stupid enough to put this on the web. But, they get a lot of money from soybean companies, vegetable oil companies, and so maybe that's the reason. Maybe coconut oil is still a threat to them. Coconut oil has certainly experienced a real resurgence. Tropical oils have experienced a resurgence in the US. So, and then there's also our friends CSPI. For those of you who saw my talk yesterday, they're the ones who were in charge of the retraction letter, always on the right side of science. And they were saying they've always been against saturated fats, and they were pushing trans fats, and they did this particularly in movie theaters, getting rid of any kind of butter popcorn or coconut oil popcorn, and they got rid of all the fats in restaurants and all the fryers. So this meant that there was, by the end of the 1980s, all the fats used in restaurants, in processing, in food service, in cafeterias, everywhere was hydrogenated vegetable oils. And I'm sure it's a similar situation in this country and others. But then, whoops, partially hydrogenated vegetable oils contain trans fats. And these are some of the original researchers who were interested and involved in figuring out, understanding trans fats and understanding their role and why they were potentially a danger to health. And so, not due to their work, but eventually when Harvard caught whiff of it and Harvard decided to get involved, then the FDA decided to ban trans fats. And I don't know what the situation is with trans fats here, but it's not bad. It's not banned. So, well, I'll just tell you a little story about it. Trans fats were banned because they slightly raise LDL cholesterol. So we all know what we think of LDL cholesterol. And I don't think that was a correct reason for banning them. They were also banned largely on the basis of epidemiological data. However, trans fats, those other researchers I just showed you, they did find a number of other disturbing health effects of trans fats, which makes me not sorry they're banned, even if it was for the wrong reasons. But the problem is, what replaces trans fats? This is a huge issue. And again, you have to remember, this is the polyunsaturated molecule, not stable. It's not stable unless it's hydrogenated. So still not stable. If you can't hydrogenate it, it's not a stable molecule. And so vegetable oil companies started going back to all their chemistry labs and figuring out, well, what were they going to use? They needed a newfangled something or other to replace hydrogenated fats, and this is what they've come up with. So they've genetically modified soybeans to produce less of the particular fatty acids that seem to cause rancidity, like linoleic, linolenic. They've tried to change the expression of those particular fatty acids. A lot more sunflower oil, which is naturally a little more stable, has come out because it's higher in some monounsaturated fats. And then they've made this thing called interesterified oils, which where they take each triglyceride, in a fatty acid, they have triglycerides, they swap around the actual carbon molecules. And anyway, that is, who knows what that is? And, probably another trans fats in 20 years' time. But all of these are expensive options. What we really should do is just go back to using saturated fats, right? We should just go back to using lard and tallow and suet, natural, non-oxidizing, but we can't because our dietary guidelines put a limit on saturated fat. So that's why we have in all of our restaurants still, they're just using the cheapest option. So this is what I wanted to say, which is the other way in which we talk about the polyunsaturated fats is that these are omega-6s. That's another way you might have heard of them. And omega-6s are known to have inflammatory effects, right? And part of the reason for just showing you this chart is that you get some omega-6s in nuts and in other places. Most of them come from vegetable oils. And probably some of you've heard of the omega-3, omega-6 ratio. You're supposed to keep that ratio relatively high on omega-3s and relatively low on omega-6s. And people are always telling you, spend a lot of money on omega-3s to get that ratio up. Well, you're never going to have, or maybe some of you do, but if you're eating a lot of vegetable oils, you're going to be spending a fortune in your omega-3s to get your omega-3s ratio up. The best way to get that ratio, if you believe in it, in good shape, is to just not have omega-6s. Keep your omega-6s down. And even healthy people who tend to binge on nuts might be having too many omega-6s. So you do have to watch out for that, especially with all these new nut flours around that people are baking with. So it's just something to be aware of. This is to show you what is happening in restaurant fryers across the country, is that they've just gone back to regular soybean oil, corn oil. And this is another thing, I bring this up also for this crowd who probably is very health conscious, but you may not know what your oil, the restaurant that you go to, is frying in. And I know in America, all the McDonald's, every fast food chain, and really it's not even the fast food chains that, which probably you avoid, but every mom and pop restaurant where they have fried food, they're frying in just regular oils. And I don't think I have time to go into the whole story of how scary heated vegetable oils are. And I'm not, flogging my book, but I will tell you at the end of chapter 9, should you choose to if you want to get it, it really has the whole incredible story that I came across. These are just some of the toxic oxidation products that are in heated oils, and the kinds of effects that they have. Aldehydes. One of the aldehydes is a formal marker for your cancer risk. And aldehydes are created, are just created in huge amounts when they fry food in polyunsaturated oils. I just want to say something about olive oil, because everybody asks me about this. Olive oil is a little different from a polyunsaturated seed oil because it only has one double bond, so it's a monounsaturated fat. So again, you think of a double bond as something that can open up and grab an oxygen, and that's oxidation, which causes inflammation. If you've only got one double bond, you've only got one hand out there, one other oxygen, so it's a bit more stable. And in the number of the experiments where they've looked at what happens when you heat oils, the most toxic oxidation products are produced with polyunsaturated fats because they have the most bonds that can open up. There's a kind of olive oil is kind of in between range. And the lowest oxidation products are, of course, with saturated fats, which have no double bonds. But monounsaturated fats are sort of in between there. And that's why I say for salad dressings, use olive oil, right? Any non-heated application, sound like a food executive. Anything you're doing to cook in the kitchen, use olive oil if you're not going to heat it. Don't use any polyunsaturated fats, and that includes canola oil, which is maybe is a little bit of a better blend, but still it's got polyunsaturates in there. And for cooking, really just use saturated fats. Try to say the word lard and not feel disgusted. And then buy some lard, which is like fantastic to cook with. When I started cooking with lard, I couldn't get over like how flaky, well, we don't make pie crust anymore, but really wonderful it is to cook with. And avoid fried food in restaurants, unless you really know that they're unless you found the restaurant that cooks with tallow again. And this is, of course, entirely in contrast to everything that your experts are telling you, which is to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fatty acids. And, at this point, this recommendation now really is just hanging by a thread.